Hi, we had a little production problem with my first part here, but I'm going to show it from this point on. We started with a biga. The biga I made last night was 2 cups of flour and 2 cups of water and a scant 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. Just something to get bubbling, get the yeast going, and primarily it's a flavor agent, so it makes the bread taste better than it would taste if you didn't use a biga. And then this morning, I began work with my key components here, which are flour, a good all-purpose flour, either Sarasota or King Arthur all-purpose flour. It doesn't need to be bread flour. Bread flour almost has too much protein content for this. I use kosher salt, instant yeast, active dry yeast, doesn't need to be fancy. I think this is pretty much a necessary thing, which is a hand scraper. It's just plastic, a big bowl, and something to measure with, and something to measure flour with, and something to measure water with. So I had added the entire biga to this big bowl. So I started out with basically 2 cups of flour, 2 cups of water in the biga. I added 3 cups more of water. Just RO water, lukewarm, doesn't need to be hot, doesn't need to be any specific temperature. Just shouldn't be ice cold and it shouldn't be boiling hot. And then to that I added 2 teaspoons of yeast, just active dry yeast. Oh, and I forgot to say that I have this bread whisk, which is really a cool instrument. You can buy them online for mixing the bread. It really works wonderfully. And then I added flour, about 2 cups at a time. I added 4 cups of flour. So now this mixture that I have has 5 cups of water and 6 cups of flour. And you see the consistency it is. It's not a dough and it's not a batter, but it's pretty pretty soupy, not a dough at all. And this I'm gonna let sit for about a half an hour to 40 minutes to let the yeast develop. There's no salt in this yet. This is a 4 ingredients bread. It's got flour and water and yeast and salt. And later on I'll get olive oil and salt and the sort of toppings for it. But for right now, this is all it is. So again, in summary, we got, at this stage, 6 cups of flour and 5 cups of water and 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast, if you count the yeast that I put in the biga, and no salt yet. Okay, we've done our auto lice about 40 minutes. You can see that this is actually starting to become a dough. It's got bubbles in it. Now we just need to work more flour into it and work our salt into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is add the salt. Again, I use kosher salt, about a tablespoonful. If you use regular salt, you got to use less of it. And sprinkle it along the top. Now this is different than the salt that will go on at the end before we put it in the oven. And now I'm just going to add flour 2 cups at a time. Maybe just a cup at a time. So this would be cup 7 of flour. And we'll do it just a cup at a time. And you can see when you look at it, now it's starting to form a bit of a shaggy dough already, because the flour kind of layers out on the side of it, and as you stir, it works into it, and the dough is starting to take some shape. You actually don't need to knead this dough very much because it goes through these different rises, and it almost kneads itself. So that was 7. I want to put the 8th cup of flour in.
Probably want to start using your scraper too.
Yeah, well, I think I'm a little away from that yet. Maybe after this cup of flour. Yeah, Gene's right. At a certain point in time, I want to quit using the stirrer and switch to my scraper, which kind of helps knead it a bit. So it's starting to form what Gene calls a shaggy dough. You know, it's still too wet to knead. I'm going to put another cup in. This is cup number 9. And again, the flour, when I do it myself, I just add as much as I need to add. I'm trying to quantify here. For you folks who remember, you may use more, you may use less. I'll throw that whole thing in there. But I think this will be the last one that I use the stirrer on. So we're at 9 cups?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I mean, this is definitely kind of a shaggy dough now. I'm having to work it to... Unfortunately, from this point on, it becomes a function of feel. And I'll try to explain to you what I'm feeling or what I'm trying to feel. And it's just, you know, as the dough starts to take on a polymer or become a polymer, it just gets harder and harder to work with the spoon. So I'm going to call it a day with my spoon and take up my scraper. Try to get all this flotsam and jetsam off of this. And now I start to add flour by handfuls. But what I'll do is I'll take a cup and we'll try to quantify how close to 10 cups we get before we stop. Because once we get it to a dough, a reasonable doughy consistency, then we won't put any more flour into it. We'll just knead it with wet hands, and you'll see how slick that works. Okay, so now I have my scraper, and I've got my 10th cup of flour, and I'm just going to add some flour to the edge of it and work that scraper around. What I do is I just scrape down the sides, trying to scrape the flour to the bottom of the dough mass. The dough is still kind of wet, but you can see I can almost knead it a little with this. It's really almost at the point where I can just let it sit.
Yep.
So I think you see I used just a scant part of this 10th cup of flour. And yeah, we're gonna let it rest for a while. Maybe about another 40 minutes. You know, just to let it rest, and then we'll see if I can knead it with wet hands. This is the shaggy dough, alrighty? So you see the way it doesn't quite pull away from the bowl. I think it needs a little more flour before I start to do wet turns of it. It's just a little wet yet. You see it kind of sticks to the thing, so I'm gonna put a little more flour around. Again, not very much. Just along the sides and maybe a little on the top. I'm gonna get this so that I can hand turn it. It's almost there. A little more flour. Yeah, that's getting there. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm gonna let that had rested about 40 minutes. I'm gonna let this rest about 30 minutes, and then I'll do it with water on my hands. So it's coming along nicely. I'll cover it up with just a rag. Okay, now we're gonna do the kneading. It really isn't kneading, it's stretching. And you see the dough develop, it's tacky, you know? It's not horribly wet. So this is magic to some extent. And I learned this from Jane, who learned it from one of her bread making books. But instead of doing it with flour, you do it with wet hands. So first I wet my little scraper and get things moving. I don't think this is too tacky. And then I'm gonna put cold water on my hands. This really keeps the dough hydrated nicely. Gather it up in the middle, lift it, let it stretch a little, and flop it down. Turn it, do the same thing. Do this about 3 times. Again, lifting it, let it stretch, and flop it down. Kind of form a ball. And we're gonna let it rest again. I had to let it rest for about a half an hour. We'll let it rest for another half an hour. We'll do that one more time, and then we'll pan it out. Okay, it's starting to form some bubbles now. You see it's really tacky, which is a good thing. It shouldn't stick to your hands badly. If it does, you can always add some flour and make it a little more. But see, the water allows it to pull out of the pan just fine. You know, so there's very little left in the pan. You see when I pull that out, I just let it stretch, flop it, stretch, and flop it. Usually 3 times, and it should hold a little shape at this point. So it looks perfect. You can see it's tacky with wet hands. But not bad. Now, this isn't oily at all. This is just water. So far to this bread, I've still only added yeast, flour, water, and salt. Now I'm going to let this rise for about an hour, and then I'll go to pans. Now, I'm going to do it in 2 pans, and I hope this works. My son David did this weekend, and he was able to get with a 5-cup batch of bread, a 5-cup water batch of bread. He was able to get a black one and a flat pan. Most of you probably have these flat sheet pans. I like to use the black pan from Italy that Steve Jackson got for me. It's real thin walled and really gets a nice pop rise. So we'll wait an hour. Okay, we're here to pan. So I've got my black pan greased with some Crisco and my sheet pan greased with some Crisco, and my dough is, you can see, nice and tacky and hydrated. So I'm just gonna split it in 2. We're gonna split it in 2 and get it in the pan. So again, I've wet my little scraper so I can get around this bread a little. You can see how tacky it is, but it'll work fine. Pulls away from the pan nicely. So I'm gonna grab it and split it about half and half. I take 1 piece of it in the black pan. I don't know if I should. Got a little too much in this one, you think?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, it's okay? Yeah, who cares? Okay.
Show me the bubbles.
The
Nice-
bubbles.
Nice big
bubbles
bubbles.
in it. Big bubbles in it. So,
Big bubbles.
nice bubbles. So, now we're gonna pat it out. Just gotta get more water in it. You get some water on your hands and then just pat it out. And this one's gonna be kind of a fat one because I've got a little more dough on it that I probably should have on this size pan. Maybe not. Now, I think it's just magic the way this wet dough with wet hands doesn't stick. I used to do this with flour dough, and I would end up working a lot more flour into it. The dough wasn't just hydrated, and it didn't come as nice, I didn't think. So you just stretch it to the edge of the pans, then we're gonna let it raise for about, or just let it rest in the pan for about a half an hour, and then I'll show you how I dock it and get it ready for the oven. We'll preheat the oven now to 425 degrees. This is usually the point at which I get frustrated with doing it and Jean takes over, but it's a little elastic. So we'll preheat the oven to 425 degrees, and then we'll dock the dough, put the oil on it, put the salt on it, dock it, and get it in the oven. Okay, we're ready to go. We've got our ovens heated to 425 degrees. We've got olive oil and kosher salt in the two pans of focaccia. Now, I tend to put the kosher salt on first, and just kind of liberally sprinkle it on top of the focaccia. You can put rosemary on, you can push tomatoes into it, you make pizza out of it. I like it just plain salted with nothing on it, or toasted in the morning with butter. We got that. And this is a technique for docking. You just take the olive oil and you put it on kind of liberally. You know, you don't float it all over the surface, but you know, you should have a significant amount of olive oil, and then get some olive oil on your fingers and just press your fingers through all the way to the bottom of the pan. You'll see that some big bubbles will form when you do that, but that's how it should look, okay? And then let me get that in the oven right away. Come on, open the door. I got a greasy hand. In the oven it goes. And we'll do the other one and get that in the oven. Again, a liberal swirl of olive oil. A little more over here. Not completely saturating the top, but making sure you get enough on it that it fills the holes. And in the docking, you know, I'm pressing my fingers all the way through. You can't necessarily dock it too much. There. Just wash my hands off quick. And we'll get this in the oven. Now they'll be in the oven 30 to 40 minutes. I usually set the timer for 15 minutes. And then check them at 15 minutes, rotate them, do whatever. Keep an eye on them though, because when they're this thin, sometimes it takes only 30 minutes to cook. We'll see. This is at 15 minutes. You can see that they pop risen a little, and they're brown on the backside, even in the convection oven. It's so high that they don't cook perfectly evenly. But you can see they need another 10 or 15 minutes. So I want to set the timer for 10 minutes. And I'm probably going to switch them top to bottom too, because the top is doing a little faster. So we'll put it in for another 10 minutes. Now they're getting there. The top one, a couple more minutes, just to let the backside brown a little further. And the bottom one, I think both of them can stay in another 5 minutes. They're really close to being there, but not quite perfect yet. So we're gonna set it for 5 more minutes. And then we'll pop them out. All right, they've just been going an additional 2 minutes. And this one looks perfect. You know, it looks really nice. We'll get that out of the pan. This one looks done too. So the last little bit that you do, you really need to keep an eye on it because they'll go from being not quite brown to nut brown pretty rapidly. Now I'm just gonna take them out of the pans and put them on a rack and let them cool.
Put a towel underneath.
Okay. Let me get them off of here first. I can always set the things over.
Oh, that's true. Set them over the burner. So. Ouch. Okay.
Okay.
Explain why you did that.
I did that just so that they,
You have some air
as they
underneath.
cool, they have some air underneath them. But they tend to get wet too, so
Yeah.
I put them back on top of the pan. Usually I don't touch the pan and burn my hand, but they were ready to eat in about 30 minutes or so. Okay, Gina's gonna cut one.
Should I cut a fatter end so you
No,
can see
that's
bubbles?
fine. It'll be fine. So you see the bubbles in the bread. Get a nice crumb, nice brown crust. And it's oily, so be careful with it. Even when it's hot like this, you can burn your fingers, but how does it taste? Nice and chewy?
Mm-hmm. Great.
Good. So that's how to make focaccia.